Hi, I'm here today with Michelle, who has a TikTok account called Beyond the Bet and a story of her experience as an affected other. I've been following her account for some time. It's amazing. And especially in that it really highlights some elements of problem gambling and gambling addiction that may not spring to mind. And also, she's telling a story of what it's like when a loved one has a gambling addiction. So, Michelle, thank you so much for coming.
No, thank you for having me, Jennifer. It's nice to be spreading the story and also helping to raise awareness. So, yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
Your story is you had a loved one who was addicted to gambling, but you didn't know about it.
Yeah, that's right. So, it was my dad. So, I had no idea in the time that he was alive that he had a gambling addiction. Looking back, there were signs. And I knew when I was younger, when we used to go to pubs or restaurants, he always used to go off to the slot machines for half an hour, 20 minutes, and he'd come back. And it was always a joke of the family that he was incredibly lucky with these. And he'd come back with his pockets jingling full of pound coins, a big smile on his face. And it was always seen as quite a positive, happy thing. And I also saw him do micro gambling on the horses in bingo, but I never had any idea the extent that he was gambling to what I found out after he died. But equally, I also wasn't surprised as well, which is a strange, that the extent of his addiction, I just had no idea.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common in my experience too. I mean, even as a family, we went to point and put on a few bets and we enjoyed scratch cards at Christmas. And yeah, it was always a lighthearted, fun thing. But then when I found out, it was a shock, but it was shocking, but not so surprising, really.
Yeah, you kind of know, don't you, in the back of your mind, the number of emails asking, are you feeling comfortable with your level of gambling? All of the transactions as well that I saw. And it just, yeah, it was really shocking. But at the same time, it linked with his personality, and he was quite a risk taker. He did have quite that kind of traditional addictive personality as well. But it just started to reveal a lot of things that finally clicked and made sense, because my dad used to tell a lot of white lies, and there was things that he did in his life that didn't always make sense, but I never questioned them further. And
Mm.
since finding out about his addiction, it just brought everything together, particularly the point when he told me he was living in Portugal for 5 years of his life, and he was running a vineyard, but he never allowed me to visit. He never gave me an address. He sent me some pictures, but they were always quite blurred and a bit questionable. And then, yeah, as I did some digging, found out that the inheritance he'd said he'd used to buy his vineyard in Portugal actually turned out he'd spent on gambling, and he was living in a friend's back garden, which is really sad that it
Yeah.
led that way. But it just weaved that massive lie, and that's what gambling does. So that,
Yeah. I think, yeah, that putting the pieces together after the fact, and that's pretty common as well, and we can often think, "Oh, I should have known," or "Why the clues were there, why didn't I put it together?" But there's no way we can do that, especially if someone's working very hard to hide it, even
yeah.
if they're not even if the stories seem a little bit fantastic or not exactly buoyed up by lots of facts behind them.
Yeah, exactly. And also, now I've done, because I didn't know anything about gambling and addiction, I'm still learning. But now I've done some research around it since finding out after his death. I think there's a lot out there that suggests gambling is seen as very much like an invisible addiction, because it is so easy to hide, as you say.
Exactly.
I didn't live with my dad. I lived in London, and he was living in the Midlands. So it was probably a lot easier to hide. But the fact that he was able to hide where he was living, he would do crazy things. He would come visit me in London in flip flops in the winter, pretending that he'd just got off a flight from Portugal, and he'd bring me a bottle of Vino Verde that
Oh my
he bought
gosh.
off Amazon from Portugal, but just to keep up this persona and appearance. Because now looking back, he just must have been so ashamed and so self-judgment that he'd lost all the money to gambling rather than what he told everyone he was doing.
Yes, and the way you shared on your channel on TikTok, Beyond the Bet, Beyond for Bet, the way you found out was pretty shocking as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, I actually found out that he was living homeless when he was in hospital. So sadly, a few weeks before my wedding, he got rushed into hospital. He was not living very healthily before then. The last 3 4 years of his life, he was living in social housing. He'd put on a lot of weight. He was he was drinking. He was telling me he wasn't, but I also found out after he died that he was drinking obscene amounts of alcohol as well, which makes sense now to why he wasn't losing the weight.
Mm.
Yeah, and when I was in hospital, I found out then through a friend of his that this period of time that he was supposed to be in Portugal, he'd been camping in his friend's back garden because they didn't have a spare room for him to stay, and he told no one. And he'd asked them that they'd never told me or his brother, and it was only by chance that my uncle found out that my dad was doing that and managed to get him into social housing. But my dad at the time still never told anyone that he'd lost that money through gambling. He actually came up with quite an elaborate story to say how he'd lost it. He had to get away from Portugal and had to leave, but none of it was true.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's so heartbreaking too. I mean, we understand it as people that if someone's doing something they feel ashamed of, embarrassed, that they don't want, they don't want to put it on their loved ones and they don't want to fall in their estimation. But at the same time, we think, oh God, they couldn't even tell me that. I
Yeah.
know even talking to a lot of people that they get really angry because loved ones don't tell them and they say, "Oh, I could have helped earlier." There's a whole other conversation about how we can help our loved ones, but I think that isolation,
Yeah.
it's the isolation, the related addictions or dependencies like alcohol dependency or even drugs,
Yeah.
those all come together. And I think you hit on a really important point about gambling addiction that affects both the person gambling and their loved ones is this idea of shame, that it still has a stigma that I think alcoholism and even drug addiction, we often think of those as more medical.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we understand people get addicted and you don't like the way they're acting, but it's a physical addiction. They can't help it. But gambling addiction is a behavior and they should stop it. They should be ashamed of themselves for not stopping it. And then it's all tied up too with not having any money, losing your wealth, losing a property, etc. That can bleed out shame to other people, even though it's unwarranted.
Yeah.
You've
I mean,
written stuff out.
yeah, I mean, I think it's a real complex thing, isn't it? I think I read this statistic on Gamble Aware that said something along the lines of 64% of people who have a gambling or have suffered from gambling harms never tell anyone, which I think is just shocking.
Yeah.
That many people that never tell anyone. I think also as well the fact I think because with gambling, a lot of people can't relate to it or understand it because not everyone has gambled. And as you say, it's very much viewed as a willpower thing. They can stop, it's behavioral. And I think actually until very recently, it was classed as a behavioral disorder. And then it
Yeah.
got reclassified, didn't it, in, I believe, 2013 as an addiction. Actually, it is just as addictive as alcohol or substance abuse because it activates the exact same pathways in the brain, which when I learned that, I found that crazy. So it actually really isn't, someone doesn't have control over it at all, just like they wouldn't have control over alcohol or drugs. But I think it's so unrelatable. And I think that's why there's built that stigma around it,
Yeah.
and that sense of judgment. And as you say, the complexity then of the financial element, because money is always a kind of a topic that people don't want to, it's quite shrouded anyway, isn't it? And I think the more that we can break down those barriers and those stigmas, the more that people may feel encouraged to speak out and seek help. Because I truly think, even though my dad went into hospital because of he had necrotizing fasciitis essentially, and he died of multiple illnesses, but I think gambling had a very core of his death as well, because it essentially isolated him from all of his friends, all of his family. He cut off ties with every single friend he knew because he was so ashamed of what had happened, and he just fell into deep depression. And I didn't realize he was drinking every day and then also gambling more, and it just becomes that vicious cycle. So then I think for effective others, when you've lost someone to addiction, it makes it more complex as well, because you are asking those, could I have done more questions? Could I have helped them out of it? So yeah, it makes that grief journey a lot more complex as well.
Well, and that's what I was just thinking as you're telling this story. I mean, it must have been really devastating, the fact that your father had these health problems right at the end, and then you discovered after he had died that all these other things that had been going on that you weren't aware of. I'm really sorry that happened to you.
Yeah, thank you.
It
Yeah.
sounds very difficult. I think also it's interesting, this the shame and this relation to the fact that gambling isn't really seen as an addiction in the way others are, is related to the way we're gambling now. we meaning society, but with the apps, online, all that, it's so fast. There's so many mechanisms that are really working on our brain chemistry that weren't around even 10 years ago
Yeah.
that really relieve people of their money very quickly and then also get that dopamine hit and keep them gambling and keep them hooked. And then lots of the practices of enticing people back even when they've tried to stop.
Yeah, I think it's terrible, some of the techniques that the gambling companies use, particularly in the online space, because it is so accessible. I mean, it's everywhere you look. I think when you become aware about gambling, and lots of people have said this to me as well, friends and family, when I've been talking about this, they're like, oh my gosh, the amount of adverts, and it's absolutely everywhere, from even like the lottery is a form of gambling.
And
Um,
charities now, many
yeah,
charities have a gambling component
yes,
when they want you to pledge,
yeah.
which I was really shocked at.
Yeah, exactly. And that could be so triggering for someone who's trying to recover from gambling harms. And I also, I think a friend told me that um, a utility company, for instance, uses a spin wheel as part of, not a utility company, it might have been actually a shopping
Oh,
site, uses a
it's
spin wheel.
octopus. It's
Yeah,
octopus.
yeah. Oh, it is octopus, yes. And I've heard,
Yeah.
and apparently that can again, be quite triggering for people who are recovering from gambling harms. So yeah, it's terrible. It's everywhere, and the techniques that the gambling companies use to hook people as well. You would never see that with alcohol companies, or so there's a big marked inequality of the way that gambling and then alcohol are addressed in society. And I think that needs to change. And I think that gap needs to close. And I think they need to be recognized as both equally devastating addictions.
Absolutely. And did you feel when you find out, this was of course after your father had died, about his gambling, did you feel any sense of trepidation or shame or reluctance to tell people about this issue? You've obviously gone more public with it on your TikTok account,
Yes. Yeah.
but did you feel like it reflected on you at all? I don't think it should, but I just know from other people that that can sometimes be a factor.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, actually. I've never really thought about that. I think, did it? I don't think it did, because it's probably different for me, because I don't think I had any financial involvement with, the way my dad spent his money. For me, it was more, I was so shocked and so upset about what had happened to him, and the fact that he'd been in this alone. I think for me, that really spurred me to want to share his story. I mean, there was a sense of cautiousness actually when I was first thinking about it, and I did speak to my aunt and my uncle to ask if they'd be happy if I shared my dad's story, because my dad was a very private person as well, which I think fed into his sense of not wanting to share anything. And I know that my dad would not like me doing this, and I know that he would not want me to be doing it as well, because he'd still probably be so ashamed, and he wouldn't want me to be doing this. But I think the need to share his story and the need to share with others that this is not something to be ashamed of has overridden my own sense of cautiousness and shame, if that makes sense. But I can completely understand and see how other people who've been affected may feel that kind of sense of shame, even though I don't think they should at all.
Yes, I agree completely. So you are trying to raise awareness and you are doing a run. So tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to do this year was kind of do some fundraising. And there's this really great charity called YGAM, and they focus on the prevention of gambling harms through education.
They're
Um,
great. They're
oh,
great
yeah, you know
because
them. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So they seem really great. So I wanted to do something for fundraising for an educational side of things, because I don't think there's enough around education around gambling. And I think in order to tackle this, we need to start at the core, at the heart of it, because I know you've written about this as well, that more and more children are being affected by gambling, which is just shocking, under the age of
Absolutely.
12. And that's linked very closely with video games as well. And I know YGAM do a lot of work with the link between video games and gambling, because there are strong ties there. So I wanted to do some fundraising. And since my dad's death, I've suffered, because I was present at his death, and also it was quite a traumatic time. It was over the time of my wedding, and also everything I think I found out about him following it. I've now been diagnosed and suffer with PTSD. So I lost a lot of
Yeah.
confidence around everything. And one of the big things was running, and I really loved running before. So I thought one way to challenge myself was to try and get back into running. And it may not sound like a lot, and I know people are doing marathon these days, but my challenge was I'm going to run 62 miles, a mile from every year of my dad's life across the year. And my sister, even though it wasn't her dad, but when she was growing up, he was there present a lot for her. She's going to run a race every single month. So she's doing a lot more of the legwork. So every single month this year, she's going to run a race, including a marathon. And I think she mentioned at one point as well, wanting to do a 12-hour run as well. So yeah, we're hoping by doing that, we can raise some awareness and raise some money for a really good cause as well.
And that sounds superb. And I'm not surprised to hear that you had PTSD. That sounds like a lot, like you've had to be very strong and cope with a lot of things all at once.
Yeah. No. I was just agreeing. Yeah, it has been a lot. Yeah.
I'll be sharing the link.
Thank you.
I really urge everybody to go check out YGAM and to check out Michelle's run and do support it. I think this education piece, we can all benefit from it. Young people, obviously, so they understand the forces that are working on them and they understand what's happening in these games. But also people like us, like you, I'm still learning. And the more you learn, the more insidious the actions of the kind of bad actors, or even just the effect of gambling on people. Now that you can do it so quickly, you can do it anywhere because it's on your phone. And you're basically being promoted it every time you watch something on sports or watch TV where there are ads or browse. Once you visited one gambling website, now they know, and they're constantly hawking it to you. And I think also we have this growing. You can see the strategy too, how they're focusing more on women, for example, with the bingo and the fun, do it with your friends appeal. So I think this awareness is going to be it's so good and kind of getting kids especially early so they understand the landscape that they're in.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also with a growing online world and the accessibility of it is just so needed, that education piece around it, because it's actually terrifying how I had no idea about the links between video gaming and gambling. Like you wouldn't initially think, would you? But the
No.
fact that it can be a direct link to that is just crazy and terrifying at the same time.
Yeah, instilling behaviors that can grow and cause problems,
Yeah,
down the line.
yeah.
Well, Michelle, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your story.
Oh, thank you.
It was very hard, but you look like you're doing better and doing this great awareness, the run, and all of us affected others really appreciate that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share this as well. I think it's just so important that we talk about this more. I'm not an expert on it, but I think just by sharing those stories and being open and honest about it, I think it can just encourage one more person to speak out. Because looking back now, I'm also quite frustrated at myself as well about how sometimes I would be around my dad because I knew something was up and something wasn't right, but I didn't know exactly what. So I'd get frustrated at him. Whereas now, I wish if I had more of that understanding and approached him with a less judgmental nature, it might have maybe encouraged him to open up. I think if we can all take something that away with the people around us who may be suffering, even if they told us or not, yeah, it can help tackle the devastating thing that gambling harms is really. But yeah, thank you so much.
Very wise words to end with. So thank you so much. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of you over time and have a good rest of your day. Thanks,
Yeah,
Michelle.
thank you, Angie.